Hi, I'm Caitlin,
And I'm Clarinda,
and this is Not Just Patients.
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thank you so much for tuning in to our special Rare Disease Day episode. Our guest today is Emily Reuben OBE, who is going to talk to us about advancing rare disease care through patient advocacy.
Emily co founded Duchenne UK after her son was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, DMD. A graduate of Oxford University and former Channel 4 News and CNN international journalist, Emily launched the Duchenne Children's Trust in 2012, which later merged with Joining Jack to become Duchenne UK. Emily is a leading advocate for patients representing the community at the US FDA, the EMA, the MHRA, NICE, and the Scottish Medicines Consortium. She has served on the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry Patient Advisory Council, MHRA Consultative Forums, and the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway Steering Group, and now sits on the board of the Association of Medical Research Charities. Emily was awarded an OBE in 2023 for her services to people with DMD. Emily, what an honor. It's really, really lovely to have you here to celebrate Rare Disease Day. And it's just great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I was really thrilled when I got the invitation, so it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
So, I know that you have a really personal and emotional story to your journey in advocacy. Uh, we briefly touched upon it in your bio, but we'd love to hear more about your story and what got you on this whole journey.
Well, this wasn't where I imagined my life to be. When I was a little girl, I dreamed of being a journalist, and I came from a very creative family. My dad was a violinist for the London Symphony Orchestra, and my aunt actually was the first woman to win the Booker Prize. So I grew up in
Wow.
a very culturally rich, loving family, and I wanted to be a journalist. That was my dream, to
Mhm,
travel the world, to tell people stories. And I had to fight really hard to get there,
mhm,
but eventually I landed my dream job as a reporter and presenter for Channel 4 News and then later CNN. Um, and then, almost out of the blue, my son, my firstborn child, my precious Eli, was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And overnight, I went from covering other people's tragedies really
Mm,
to being at the center of my own. And that moment of diagnosis, I think, is so deeply profound and
mhm,
shocking. And it's something that I have in common with every single parent who goes through
mm,
that diagnosis. The idea that your life is on one trajectory
mhm,
and all of a sudden that trajectory is torn away from you, and instead you're left with this unimaginable grief and shock, and
mm,
trying to get your head around all of the huge implications of having a child with Duchenne. There I was thinking he was growing up to be the next Jude Bellingham, where in fact his muscles were dying on him. And
mm.
even from birth, his muscle strength was 20% weaker than your average baby, which is why he struggled with all the little things that my friends found so easy.
mhm,
So he was diagnosed at 3.5. And for a long, long time, I was just bereft and shocked and had no idea how to process, manage, or even, I guess, respond to what that
Mm,
diagnosis meant.
I mean, I can't even begin to imagine, Emily, what that's like. I mean, what's interesting, and Clarinda and I have discussed this a few times, is that so I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at 3 months old, and I bore none of that burden myself. But I can't
yeah.
even imagine what the impact was like, and they speak about it to me sometimes on my parents. I was their first child as well, and the wider family, because, to a certain extent, for myself, again, it's all I've ever known, so it wasn't such a big shock. It was just something I grew up with. But also, you're not caring for yourself at that point. There's a whole family around you who have to do that, and I can't quite imagine what it would be like to sort of the sense of worry for your child, and also, I guess,
Mm.
in that perspective, especially with rare disease, that sort of helplessness that you must have felt at that time.
Yeah.
And I suppose that is what led you to sort of eventually founding Duchenne UK. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of that process that you went through from a career in sort of journalism to how you shifted to, running a huge patient organization.
Yes, it wasn't easy, and initially I just couldn't imagine how my skills as a journalist would have any bearing at all on running a
Mhm.
patient organization. But actually, there were so many skills that I learned as a producer and a correspondent that were transferable.
Mhm.
The idea of being led by truth, being led by evidence. That's
Mm.
one of the founding principles of Duchenne UK, and I think that's critical. Being able to explain your narrative and express yourself in a meaningful way to various groups of stakeholders is absolutely key. So, my background actually did help an enormous amount. And in some ways, I was in one way, I was extremely lucky because this story isn't really about just Emily Reuben. It's also about an incredible woman called Alex Johnson. And she's from Wigan, in the north of England, and I'm from London. And we never would have met had it not been for both our sons being diagnosed with Duchenne. So Eli was diagnosed when he was 3.5, and her son Jack was diagnosed at a similar time. And we met in the ladies' lavatories at a conference for Duchenne in Birmingham
Mhm.
shortly after our sons had been diagnosed, and we were both broken and we were
Mm.
crying in the loos. We'd escaped to the lavatory to cry. And she had set up a charity joining Jack, and I had set up Duchenne Children's Trust. And that was a friendship that has enabled me to do what I do, enabled us to achieve what we've achieved because we're in it together, you know.
Mm.
And I think what the story of Duchenne UK is you. If I look back now and see everything we've achieved, it feels like it was a linear, planned, logical strategy, 10-year strategy.
Mhm.
It was anything but that. um, so Alex had set up Joining Jack. I'd set up Duchenne Children's Trust, and we ended up funding a few things together. So in 2016, the obvious thing to do was to merge and
Mhm.
form a national organisation called Duchenne UK, and that's what we did. And I think what is, if you want to look at the story of how we grew, it was really that lived experience as a patient expert. So
Mhm.
every time we came up against a barrier for our sons, be it care, be it access to clinical trials, be it new treatments,
Mm.
that was what motivated us to look at those
Mhm.
challenges, understand them, and change it. So, the
Mm.
four guiding principles I would say of Duchenne UK are: we disrupt, so we come in, we see what the problems are and we disrupt them. We innovate, so we create innovative solution. We create, so we embed that innovative solution into the ecosystem, and we accelerate because we don't have time.
Mhm.
Mm.
Our sons have a pediatric progressive rare disease. Their disease is
Yeah.
getting worse every day. So we don't have time on our side. So I think those are the four things that have guided Duchenne UK. And I'll give you one example. So when the boys were 4 or 5, we wanted to get them onto a clinical trial.
Mhm.
And there were very few clinical trials back in those days. And, if I can just explain from a parent's view what getting on a clinical trial feels like. So when your son is diagnosed with Duchenne, you feel like you are on the Titanic and you're drowning.
Mhm. Mhm.
And a clinical trial is a lifeboat.
Mhm.
There's
Yeah.
the opportunity for hope. There's the opportunity to potentially give your child a disease modifying treatment.
Mhm.
But in the UK, we couldn't access those lifeboats because even though we had some of the key opinion leaders internationally, we didn't have the infrastructure to be able to recruit boys into clinical trials. We didn't have enough nurses, clinical trial coordinators. So we convened a meeting of all the stakeholders and we set up what's now called the Duchenne Hub UK, which is a network of clinical trial sites. So when Eli and Jack were diagnosed, there were only 2 hospitals doing very little research.
Mhm.
Where there are now 11 hospitals around the UK, all of them running clinical trials. There are now
Mm.
over 500 boys taking part in clinical trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We've invested nearly £4 million in funding those doctors and nurses. Not only that, we created a very innovative funding model with NIHR where we funded 100% of the post in the first year, and then that tapers down to 50 and 20%. Meanwhile, the money that comes in from industry is reinvested into those posts so they become self-sustaining. And the final piece that we did was to create what's called the Clinical Trial Finder, which is like clinicaltrials.gov, but it's a really brilliant resource for patients in the UK to find out what clinical trials are happening where, how to register your interest, and how to take part in research, because we want the UK to be a beacon of activity for clinical trial research in the UK. I mean, in the world.
Yeah. So, yeah, I can just see the passion and everything, Emily, coming through, and it's clear that was a driving force. I'm going to ask you to backtrack a little bit. I live with a rare disease. I was diagnosed at 25, and but I am a mother. I have a 4-month-old son and I have a 5-year-old daughter. And so now I can kind of put those two together and imagine myself, applying my rare disease diagnosis to my children. And I can imagine my brain just exploding because with my own rare disease, just I was, as a science communicator, being able to find so little information out there and completely relating to your feelings of being bereft and, just feeling like you're sinking or like you're drowning, but m- magnified exponentially if it were my children in that situation. So how did you get from that place to this powerhouse state that you're in now, where you're doing all these things? And I mean, so just talk us through. And also, I want to understand, mindful that we have a global audience and they might not fully understand Duchenne UK or the work that your organization does. So, how did you even get to that place where you started the organization? And then you can talk a little bit about how it grew to the point where it is now.
Well, Duchenne is, and by the way, I really appreciate you both sharing your personal stories, because I think, that lived experience is absolutely critical to understanding rare disease or understanding
Mhm.
disease,
Mm.
and needs to be at the front and center of everything, of all decision making. Um, so Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a pretty gruesome disease. It's a
Mhm.
diagnosed in childhood. It mainly affects boys, and it's severely disabling and life limiting. So, when Eli was diagnosed, he was 3.5. He was running around like any quote unquote, normal looking child, although I
Mm.
hate that word, but he
Yeah,
didn't look like he had Duchenne, to
yeah.
the untrained eye. And while he was playing in the room outside, the doctors said to us that he would be in a wheelchair by the age of 10 or 11. He would be
Oh,
completely paralyzed in his mid-teens, in what should be the prime years of his life, and that life expectancy is early 20s, and that he would die of respiratory or cardiac failure. And to say
wow.
that to a parent
Gosh.
whose son is 3 years old
Hmm.
is just cataclysmic.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Cataclysmic. And I just fell into a chasm of despair and un, unimaginable grief. I felt like I was built of glass, and if someone just touched me, I would shatter into 1,000 pieces. It's
Hmm.
so painful. And
Mhm.
I speak to newly diagnosed families, and I'm heartbroken every time I do, because I know that point of diagnosis is the darkest place that
Yeah.
anyone will ever go to be told that your child is dying. It's the darkest
Yeah.
place that anyone will go to. And I can say that now without crying because, well, I'm on antidepressants, which most families,
Mm.
most parents are. And
Yeah.
I'm lucky to have a really amazing therapist who I've seen the same persons for 13 years. And I think I've been so lucky to have that, because otherwise I think the strain of having a child diagnosed with Duchenne, the strain that it puts on your family, the strain that it puts on raising other children. I've got two, incredible daughters. I want to be a mother for them.
Yeah.
I want to have a happy marriage with my husband, and those things you have to really fight really hard for
Yeah.
when you're dealing with this cataclysmic piece of news.
Yeah.
So I would say that how I went from that Emily Reuben to this Emily Reuben is crying an ocean of tears,
Hmm.
every single night for the
Hmm.
first 3 years, crying myself to sleep, having to dig so deep when I'm trying to educate myself about Duchenne.
Yeah.
In those first few years, Alex, I talked about my co-founder, we traveled the world meeting scientists, meeting
Mm.
regulators. We lobbied at the FDA. We made it our business to find out who was doing what in Duchenne and how could we help them. We had to sit through hundreds of presentations where we watched that slide showing the natural history of Duchenne, where boys
Mm.
walk until they're 8 or 9, then it falls off a cliff, and then they die.
Mm.
These things are so unbelievably painful,
Hmm.
Yeah.
but they help you to build up a resilience and a strength that enables you to look people in the eye and talk with authority about your
Mm.
experience and what needs to change and what needs to happen. So, I wouldn't want to go back to those early years,
Yeah. Yeah.
all the money in the world. They were so desperately painful.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember the first moment that I just broke down. Eli was at sports day. He was 4 years old, and they did this running race, and he just stopped halfway through and broke into tears. And, those moments are just sort of
Yeah.
etched into my brain like horrific battle scars.
Mm.
So I don't want to sugarcoat it. Those early years were horrendous beyond all description.
Yeah.
What got me through it was therapy, antidepressants, and meeting Alex, really, and having a shared warrior in this
Mm.
battle. We thought the same way, we had the same reactions to things. We were so committed to finding treatments, to saving our sons,
Mm.
and as it turns out, saving a generation and saving a population, because we're in this for every single family with Duchenne now. So many of them are my friends. I've seen Duchenne boys, friends of mine, lose their sons. It's an unbelievably tight knit, committed, incredible community. And, Alex and I are fighting for every single child and adult with Duchenne today.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's it's so difficult because obviously, it's a terrible thing to have to experience with your child. But I guess what you've done is you've taken that sort of emotion and experience and passion and turned it into fight. And I wonder, you mentioned a period of just sort of like loneliness, depression, helplessness before you met Alex. And I wonder how did you make the decision, I suppose, to initially set up a patient group? It might seem like an obvious question, but what made that switch? A lot of people kind of wouldn't instinctively think that that was a next step, to set up that community, but that's what you did. And I wondered if you could talk about kind of how that came about.
Well, yes. I mean, after Eli was diagnosed, I couldn't even bring myself to Google Duchenne because it
Hmm.
was so bleak.
Hmm.
And at the time, I was working for CNN, and I remember I was covering the royal wedding of Prince William and Catherine for CNN, and I was standing outside Buckingham Palace all night reporting to all the US affiliate stations. And, it was a
Mm.
great night of broadcasting. I had a great time. And then I just got home and I collapsed. I think I'd been in denial. I hadn't Googled anything. I just stayed focused on my job, try not to think about it, use work as an escape. And I called my boss and I said, I've got to tell you what's happened, and I can't come into work. I need some time. And then I started, gingerly researching, and I got put in touch with a mom in America called Tracy Seckler, who had set up a patient advocacy group called Charlie's Fund. And she
Hmm.
said to me, listen, if you've got the fight in you, we need you.
Yeah.
We need articulate parents who can raise money and who can move the needle. And, I realized in that moment that I did have a choice. I had a choice to be defined by Duchenne and what it would
Mm.
do, or I could fight. I could be defined by my response to fight.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. That's what we did. So we were very fortunate. We've got an amazing group of friends, very generous, very kind with their time, with their money. One friend paid for me to get a website set up so many people gave me advice about what to do, who to meet, who to speak to, who to get
Yeah.
on my scientific advisory board. And so with that support, I found the strength to set up the Duchenne Children's Trust. And, our opening fundraiser, we made nearly £200,000, which is unheard of for a
Wow.
rare disease that no one can pronounce. So,
Yeah.
and I set myself a target. I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. Let's raise 1 million in the first year. And a lot of people,
Yeah.
I think they were worried about my mental health. And, by the way, I was also pregnant with my third child at that point. And they were like, hold on, Em, let's be careful about this. You've got to protect yourself and look after yourself. But I was like, no, what we need is £1 million to move the needle. £10,000 is not going to move the needle. £1 million enables us to invest in preclinical work or in IND enabling work or large animal tox studies, or £1 million is important amount. That's what we're going to aim for. And I look back now and we've raised nearly £35 million,
Wow, incredible.
which is insane.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
never ever would have believed that could have been possible. But when you start off with the right message, and when you start off with a goal, which is to end Duchenne, and that is your North Star, that is your guiding light, and you can show results from what you've done. I think that's the key thing. We have such an amazing track record of proving that we have impact in all areas
Yeah.
of this paradigm. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't remember the question now, but that's the sort of
Answered it
potted
perfectly.
history about how I got
Yeah.
to, that grieving mother, to translating that lived experience into real profound change.
Amazing. And I think what's always astounding, I mean, Emily, you're a perfect example and probably the first example that I heard, but getting to know more and more about sort of rare disease advocacy groups, it's so difficult to set up a charity, full stop. But also, like you say, to get people to care about it, to get people involved from a rare disease perspective where there's so few people who are affected by it or who understand it. It's such a difficult thing to do, while also, of course, being a caregiver at that time and a parent and everything. But it always astounds me how often rare disease patient advocacy groups are just set up by a parent at their kitchen table, and just the sort of passion and the drive that they have because of that. And it's incredible how much that can overcome all of the really heavy barriers that there are to setting up that kind of organization. And that actually brings me on a little bit to the next question. So you've spoken about it from your perspective, but I wonder, for our sort of Rare Disease Day episode, if you could maybe summarize, although there are many, so I know we could speak about this for an hour, but we talk on this podcast about patient involvement a lot. It's the whole topic of the podcast. But for the Rare Disease Day episode, I wondered if you could talk about the specific challenges that people with rare diseases face, and also, of course, their caregivers and family members too. What's different or what's more difficult to those facing more common diseases?
It's a really good question, and I think a lot about this. I think for Duchenne and for rare diseases, from the caregiver perspective and also from the patient perspective, people not knowing or understanding what your disease is really tough.
Yeah.
So if I'd said to my friends, Eli has cancer, they would know what I meant. They would be, that's devastating.
Yeah.
What kind? What can we do? What treatment? You say to someone, Eli has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and they look at you blankly. And we had a really stark example of this earlier in the summer. There was a treatment going through NICE, which is the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, that runs health technology assessment for new products, for new drugs. And the opening slide described Duchenne as a disease that causes muscle weakness in children. Alex was the patient expert on that call, and she challenged the chair, and he wouldn't respond. So we had a call with NICE, and at the second appraisal meeting for that drug, there were 7 slides describing what Duchenne is, which is a severely disabling, life-limiting, catastrophic disease.
Mm.
And when I say catastrophic, I mean it's like a cluster bomb going off in
Yeah.
the life of a family. As you was talking about early, Caitlin, it's not just the impact on the patient, but that
Yeah.
grows and grows as the patient grows. It's the impact on the family, the
Yeah.
parents, the siblings, the grandparents, the friends. You know, that initial diagnosis is a cluster bomb going off in your life. And then when you have a progressive disease, it's seeing your son gain the ability to walk, to jump, to climb stairs, and then see him lose those abilities.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
with Duchenne, there's never any closure. There's never. I spoke to a father whose child was born with a severe disability, and he said to me, when my son was born, that was the reality. It wasn't going to change, and
Yeah.
over time, I made my peace with it. But
Yeah.
with Duchenne, you can't do that
Yeah.
because you've always got a new reality. You know,
Mm.
you're always celebrating a milestone and then living in terror of what the next milestone of loss is going to be. What is that next milestone of loss? And I think that is, you know, really brutal reality to live with. And I think that is particular to a lot of rare diseases. I also just wanted to reflect for a minute on, you know, in my space, a lot of rare diseases, what we're really talking about is pediatric onset diseases. We are talking about
Mm.
diseases in childhood.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that is very misunderstood. And I think the challenges that we face in Duchenne in developing drugs is because they're rare, right? It's
Yeah.
small patient groups, there's huge variability in phenotype. Patients are spread across the world where standards of care are very different, very difficult to get a cohesive patient group that you can test a treatment on. But it's not just because they're rare,
It's
it's
because
also
it's
because
children.
they're in children.
Yeah.
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 You know, where the baseline is constantly changing, where the instruments that you have to measure effective drugs are often instruments designed for adult diseases.
Yeah.
And so I think it's two things. It's not just that it's rare, but it's also that it's in children. And the thinking that we have within some of the projects that we fund, including Project Hercules, is to think more about how can we have regulatory flexibilities for children?
Yeah.
Because it's not just that they're rare, it's that they're diseases that develop in childhood which present unique and very difficult challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And we have spoken about unique challenges with rare diseases and the need for, I mean, just the fact that research is scarce and why it's scarce. And I mean, obviously, some of the reasons are that the patients are all over the place and hard to find, hard to gather the numbers. It's a numbers game, right? You have the numbers, you can get a drug to market, you can show commercial viability, but and then yeah, you're right that pediatric trials are hard to run even with common diseases. So then the complexity of that in with rare diseases is exponential. How do you think that patient advocacy serves to uh, overcome some of these challenges?
Well, I mean, I think patient advocacy is absolutely critical, but the role of patient advocacy is not to try and make everyone feel better in a broken system.
Hmm.
The role of patient advocacy is to see where the system is broken and not working and really, really be laser focused on fixing that, which
Hmm.
is really, really hard. I'm not saying that's easy. It's really, really
Absolutely.
hard.
Yeah.
But you know, we do have a really unique perspective. You know, I feel like patient advocates are the only people in this ecosystem with no other agenda other than developing and getting access to safe and effective treatments that aren't going to bankrupt public health systems.
Yeah.
That is our only agenda. And, you know, when I came into this space, everyone talks about bad pharma. yes, I know that narrative, but some of the most incredible people I've worked with have been in pharma.
Yeah.
They have an agenda, of course we do, we know their agenda, but other people in the ecosystem have agendas too. And it took me a long time to realize some of those agendas.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I'm fully aware of them, it's changed the way I operate, it's changed the way I work. But what I'm trying to say is don't doubt yourself as a patient advocate,
Mm-hmm.
because your motives are the most honourable motives. You don't have any other motivation other than to get safe and effective treatments.
Yeah.
And what we need is a regulatory system that will enable us to do that. So, Clarinda, when you talked about, the challenges in rare disease and the small patient numbers, that is a challenge. But if the regulatory system were able to adapt,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
it would no longer be a challenge. We wouldn't have to constantly explain why there's variability in these outcome measures.
Mm-hmm.
Why there's limitations in this data, why we can't extrapolate from this 15 years into the future because we don't have the patient numbers to do that. Why, a gene therapy trial only has 100 patients in Duchenne, because, that is
Mm-hmm.
That's a
realistically
great number. Exactly.
who we can recruit. So we need to stop saying, it's such a challenge. Let's work together to make the regulatory system flex and adapt to those challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really love that, Emily, because, we've had quite a few conversations, I think, on the podcast, and I don't think this is a bad thing or bad advice, but actually a lot of the times we've been talking about how patients can get involved in all these different processes, whether it be with industry or research or regulatory approval, HTA, etc. And Clarinda and I did the U-Party training, which helped sort of train us up for that in a way. And a lot of the time it's, to get in the room and to be taken seriously, sometimes you have to change your narrative or the way that you're saying something to, as well as saying, your motive in terms of, getting patients access to the best care. It's also altering that in a way that it meets their values. So again, whether it's making something cost efficient or whether it's ensuring that, there's the clinical or the sample size that powers so you can get a statistically significant endpoint out of your trial. It's about, we talk about patients maybe learning that language a bit so they can speak in those rooms and be taken seriously, and that the other stakeholders can see the value. And actually, I still think that's true, but maybe, as you say, especially in rare disease, it's about speaking to them to explain why actually the system won't work in this situation. How can we adapt or change it? So I really love what you said there. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you navigate, therefore, collaborating with these different stakeholders and how you get them to kind of change what feels like quite a rigid, difficult to change system.
And
I think
sorry, if I may, I have something on the back of that as well, which is, how did you, first of all, even before that, I mean, so of course you seem to navigate talking to different stakeholders like a pro, but how did you even get into this space where you feel like an expert in a room in a field that was never your own, you know, where you're talking science, you're talking medicine, you're talking drug development, without necessarily having been trained in those terms. But how did you get into that skin where you feel comfortable enough to talk to these experts? And then what are the different hats that you wear when you're navigating, collaborating with these different stakeholder groups? Sorry, Caitlin, I just jumped in on your question, but I had a similar question, so I hope that's okay.
I mean, it's a great question, and I never feel like I know what I'm talking about. I mean, I think,
Does.
even at university, the more I studied history at university, which arguably hasn't been at all helpful in setting up a patient advocacy group, but it did teach me that, well, for everything I learn, there's a million things I don't know. So I'm never going to be an expert, but I think there are two things. I think one thing I realized early on is that, I was so full of grief and anger and rage, but it is not going to help me or my son if I take that rage and anger into the outside world.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So don't be angry. Be solution focused
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
be collaborative. So I think that's the first thing. I don't need to be an expert in everything because I can collaborate with people who are. And I can
Yeah.
talk about Hercules later on, which is a really, really amazing example of that. When we realized that our sons weren't able to get on clinical trials and we wanted to set up a network of clinical trial sites, it seemed very obvious to us, but we were so ignorant. But actually, I think that ignorance is profoundly powerful because we didn't know what the barriers were, Alex and I,
Hmm.
and so we just ploughed on. And,
Yeah.
and I remember there was another patient group there, and they said, "Oh no, we can't possibly fund posts within the NHS. That's not what charities do." And we were like, "Well, that seems to us to be the problem. So why don't we be the solution and fund them?" And we did it, and now look where we are today. So I think having not being fully cognizant of all the challenges can be very empowering because it just gives you
Hmm.
that strength and that energy to just go forward and say, yes, we're going to do this. We were talking about, running rare disease trials and the outcome measures can be very challenging. So we
Hmm.
realized quite early on that this was a challenge in Duchenne. So we invested some money with a group who were developing a digital wearable device. And now that's used in almost every Duchenne trial.
Amazing.
So, you know, seeing what the challenges are, finding the solutions and acting on it, which is what we've done at every step of the journey, I think is now really beginning to reap rewards and bear fruit in drug development in Duchenne.
I love
Yeah.
that. And I love that almost, it's not necessarily an attitude, but it's kind of coming into a system. And if something's broken, not just accepting it because that's the way it is and that's how it is, but sort of saying, well, why not? Why can't we do that? And
Yeah.
that's how change is made, not by trying to necessarily work around a broken system, but like you said before, trying to sort of fix those little parts to see, if you can see our solution on the horizon, but there's a barrier in the way, how can we remove that barrier? And I think that's really cool and hopefully gives people a bit of a perspective in terms of, when someone says you can't do something, how can you get the right people in the room to change that and make that happen? And on that note, Emily, I wanted to know how did you find these people? It sounds like you have this really amazing network where you managed to speak to device companies, researchers. I know that you've also been in the room with policymakers and you've said that you and Alex are in the room with nice steering committees. How did you get into those rooms, especially to start with, when you didn't really have as much of a platform or network as you did now?
It's a good question because when we started, we really were the new kids on the block. And to be
Mhm.
honest, I think there was people looked at Alex and I as two mothers. I think there was definitely an element of sexism in the way we were
Mhm.
treated
Mhm.
early on.
Mm.
And we had to really, really fight to be taken seriously.
Mhm.
Um, that was tough.
Yeah.
And, we got criticism from all areas. Um,
Mm.
yeah, there were some tough moments. But we just were relentless. I mean, we just went out and met everyone we could.
Mhm.
Alex and I traveled the world. We went to conferences. We met pharma companies. Whenever anyone asked us for a meeting, we'd go. I mean, poor Alex, she was up and down to London from Manchester twice a week, 3 times a week. We did not say no to anybody. And, I think we also were extremely intelligent from the beginning, being able to grasp the challenges
Mhm.
and, see what needed to happen and what needed to change. And I think, our reputation sort of grew without us even really making that a priority. That wasn't really a priority for us, becoming,
Mhm.
Mm.
thought leaders, being in the room with people for its own sake. Our only motivation was to find a way to get treatments for Duchenne as quickly as possible. And if the science isn't there, we can accept that. But if the treatments aren't there because of human-made barriers,
Yeah.
then that is not acceptable. And that is what we have to do. And we were extremely naive in the beginning, right? We thought if we just fund the treatments, the drugs will get approved and they'll get reimbursed, because obviously they'll get reimbursed because our sons are dying of Duchenne. Who wouldn't reimburse a drug for that?
Yeah.
We don't have to do any policy or advocacy work. We will just fund the treatments, fund the clinical trial infrastructure, and and of course, how naive were we?
Yeah.
Because treatments for Duchenne were not getting approved. I mean, there were very few back then. There are a few now. And here we find ourselves 13 years later. Last year we were meeting with the Secretary of State for Health in the UK, Wes Streeting, about a policy campaign we were doing. So we really have come a hugely long way. I think it's just an organic process, and realizing where our limitations of knowledge were, and bringing people in who knew those areas and could deliver on our behalf. That's also been critical.
I think you've captured really well your own sentiments and your own attitude in this whole process. I think that there is a doggedness that goes along with patient advocacy, with really successful patient advocacy. I think that, that relentlessness, doggedness that makes you say, nothing can stop me. And I'm going to be in those rooms. Why should I not be in those rooms? All of those questions, all of those things. I really want to know, from, if you look back now, from the other stakeholders' perspectives, how you feel their attitude to you as patients, or even, for example, the sexism, how those attitudes have changed over the years, maybe, where, for example, you started out challenging some things where that were the norm because you might not have known enough. And I can imagine scientists or HD experts or all these experts saying, oh, what do they know? Versus now, the people you're meeting with, really influential people, giving you that space at the table. And when you say you've come a long way, I mean, that must feel really good. But it would be really interesting to also hear how you think their receptivity to you has changed.
That's a really good question, Clarinda. And I think it is because of our track record of delivering. And we are quite unique in the way that we have transformed the landscape of Duchenne muscular dystrophy in the UK on many levels. So I've talked about the Duchenne Hub. That's now being talked about in many areas. I'm now on an expert advisory group with another charity who are replicating our model. So we can speak with authority about how we made that happen and advise people. We also have another project called Duchenne Care UK, which has now been replicated by SMA, Spinal Muscular Atrophy UK. And that is a incredible project where we realized that patients in the UK were not getting access to standards of care. So an article was published in The Lancet, and it was translated into a patient-ready document by our colleagues in the US, but it was written for US audience. So one of the things it recommended was your child needs to have a cardiac MRI. Now, in the UK, under the NHS, you'll be very lucky to get a cardiac MRI. You won't get it. And so Alex and I would have parents calling us up in panic, about to go into their cardiology appointment, not knowing what to ask for, thinking that there are medicines, but they don't know how to access them. And there have been a few scientific papers published on, for instance, the use of ACE inhibitors, perindopril, as a prophylactic treatment for cardiac care in Duchenne. And patients in the UK weren't getting it. Alex and I's son were on it because we'd fought for it and we had the scientific publications to argue the case. So Alex, and this is really Alex's baby, Duchenne Care UK, she came up with a brilliant idea of bringing key opinion leaders together in all of the disciplines to agree upon standards of care in Duchenne. And the cardiac example is really critical because boys were dying of heart failure with Duchenne, age 15, 16, 17. And they didn't need to die because they could have been on these prophylactic treatments to protect their heart. So the first guidelines we published were endorsed by the British Cardiology Society. and they are a list of medications that your son should be given when, and what to look out for in cardiomyopathy in DMD. And we've now got over 8 or 10, I think it is, leaflets which are endorsed by each society. So we've got one in adrenal, in physiotherapy. We have got guidance coming out on psychosocial. So these are really empowering for patients because they tell them what they need to know. And after 5 years of lobbying, last year we got those guidelines endorsed by NICE.
Wow.
So patients are now empowered to go to their clinicians and say, this is what my son needs to be given now. And these are the reasons why you should give him. So we've empowered patients to advocate for their children, for their sons. And, this is a really powerful model that, as I said, is being rolled out. And I think it's these sorts of achievements that, regulators, pharmaceutical companies, they want to hear about them because they are advancing care in the UK, advancing our understanding of the disease. And that's why, I look back and, I've given speeches at the NICE conference. I gave a keynote at the MHRA annual conference. Alex has spoken privately in MHRA meetings, NICE meetings. We speak to people who are making decisions because not only do we have the lived experience of being patient experts, but we have the lived experience and the advocacy experience of identifying problems, coming up with solutions and changing the paradigm. And I think that's why, we're called upon now to speak.
Amazing.
That's
And a couple of
powerful.
OBEs can't hurt either. Congratulations. But yeah, I think,
Well,
sorry, go on.
yeah. The Queen is our royal president, and she's been an incredible support for the charities almost since we started. So,
Amazing.
yeah, I'm very grateful because that sort of support and acknowledgement, is really critical for we're still a very young organization. We're only 13 years old. I mean, our ambition is to end Duchenne and shut down, but we're not there yet. So we're very grateful to, the Queen and the incredible number of people who have supported us from the beginning. It's really powerful.
I think that's incredible. And I guess what I was hearing as well a little bit is just actually getting into those rooms, like you said earlier, getting any meeting you could, meeting the right amount of people over time. That means that sort of anyone in the Duchenne community almost knows your face. And maybe in a way that's also a reflection of it being a rare disease space. You kind of automatically become a top expert by just experiencing it and having that lived experience, but then also being in all of these different rooms, talking to all of these different people and having these initiatives, it pushes you up that ladder really quite quickly in a rare disease space, even though, in sort of the wider healthcare community, Duchenne feels like a small chunk of that. But because you've done such amazing things in Duchenne, and because there are, I can't remember what the latest statistic is, but 6,000 other rare diseases that could replicate what you've done in Duchenne and help other people as well in different communities, completely different disease areas. But because it's overcoming those barriers that sort of generally rare diseases face, it's becoming extremely impactful on the wider community as well, which I think is amazing.
Thank you for saying that. That's really nice of you, Caitlin. Thank you.
On that note as well, I'm really excited. You've spoken about some incredible initiatives already to us today, but I wondered if you could share if there's another example. And I know that you've mentioned Hercules a couple of times, and this is something that I've been following for a few years and I think is really exciting. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that, how you were involved, what the objective was, who was involved, what the steps were, and sort of what the outcome is at the moment and ongoing into the future.
I'd be more than happy to talk about Hercules. I could talk about that forever. I mean, and Clarinda, to your question earlier about not being the expert in the room, I think Hercules is a really amazing example of how I was not the expert, still am not the expert. And if it hadn't been for two incredible women, Hercules would not have come about. And actually, it wasn't our idea. It was the idea of a very passionate and dear friend of mine called Fleur Chandler, who was uniquely placed, actually, I think, to come up with Hercules, because the way she described it is that she has the heart of a Duchenne mum, because her son Dom has Duchenne, but she has the brain and the head of a health economist, because at the time she came up with Hercules, she was working in health value outcomes for respiratory disease at GSK.
Okay.
And we had a product going through NICE, and it had been given conditional marketing authorization by the EMA, and it took 2.5 years to get approval through NICE.
Wow.
And the problem with that was that the label on the drug said you could take it from the age of 6 until you stopped walking. So we had parents in the UK celebrating when the EMA gave it approval, only to see their son stop walking in the time it took for NICE to make a decision.
Wow.
And that door of hope was slammed shut in their face. And I realized, even though this drug wasn't relevant for Eli, I realized in that moment that there is something worse than having no treatment for your disease. What is worse is knowing that there is a treatment out there, but you cannot access it for your son because no one has worked out how to pay for it. And that, to me, was a light bulb moment. Now, as it turns out, the EMA has subsequently withdrawn the license for that product because the company was not able to provide the evidence to keep the approval. So, with hindsight, I can see why this was such a struggle for NICE. The evidence was very challenging. But what it did do was plant the seeds for Hercules, and for that I am grateful. Fleur just had realized that a lot of these companies, and this is true of all rare disease, they're very small, and they don't have big departments looking at health economics, and they don't plan their clinical trials to look at what evidence they will need for reimbursement decisions. So the way I describe it to people is, in order to get a drug approved, you need to climb 2 mountains. The first one is to prove that your drug is safe and effective. For that, you need to be approved by the MHRA in the UK or in the US FDA, different bodies around the world. But then in the UK and in many other countries around the world, you have to climb a second mountain, which is the reimbursement mountain, which is where you have to prove that your drug has value and that the health systems will pay for it. And this is arguably an equally challenging mountain to climb, and it needs a different set of equipment. It needs a different set of evidence. And what Fleur and I's discussions led to was a realization that we needed disease-specific evidence that companies should develop together to enable them to climb this second mountain. And the first genius thing that we did was to employ another fantastic woman called Josie Godfrey, who used to be an associate director at NICE, and she actually devised the rare disease pathway at NICE, the highly specialized technologies appraisals pathway. So she was so perfectly placed to lean into Hercules. I'd met her at certain events when she was working at NICE. I was terrified of her. But, she's since become an incredible partner, friend, advocate for Duchenne and for the challenges in health technology assessment for rare disease. So together we created a pathway that had not been built. I mean, this was the first time this had ever been done in the whole world, to get competing pharmaceutical companies to come around the table together and work together to create that evidence base. So what does that mean in real terms? Well, we took a big, long, hard look at the natural history of Duchenne, and we involved patients in describing that natural history, not just relying on clinician perspective, but asking patients, what actually happens when your son has Duchenne? How does that disease progress? And we redefined the natural history. We came up with a new stage in the disease, which is called the transfer stage, which is when patients can weight bear, but they can't walk.
Right.
Why is that important? Because it means that they can still be independent. If you can weight bear, you can transfer from the lavatory to your seat, from your seat to your bed. You can get yourself dressed. It's a really important stage, and no one was capturing it because it only lasts for 6 to 18 months. And by the time you've been from one clinic appointment to another, there's no way of articulating it. So
Yeah.
it had not been captured.
Yeah.
So we redefined the natural history model, and we have now published that, which is available for anyone to access. We also did something really profound, which is we looked at some of these outcome measures to assess the impact of a treatment on patients, and we realized that they weren't fit for purpose. And this goes back to my earlier point about trying to fit childhood diseases through
Yeah.
a system that's built for adult diseases. So what do we use to measure impact of quality of life in treatments? We use the EQ5D, which is designed for adults and common diseases. It doesn't work in Duchenne. And so we did a whole piece of work publishing why we don't think it works in Duchenne. Not only that, we developed our own. We developed a metric of 14 questions. It's called the DMD Qual. It's been translated into over 30 languages and is now being used in clinical trials across the world. And we did it. It took 3.5 years, hundreds of thousands of pounds, spoke to over 300 patients in developing it, had the input of all of our incredible pharmaceutical partners. It's a really robust piece of work.
Yeah.
And no one person could have done that. No one charity, no one company could have achieved that. It's a really incredible advert for the power of collaboration. And it's now something that's being used in drug development. And I couldn't be prouder of it because, it's really got to grips with one of the most challenging areas of health technology assessment and come up with a solution. Now, the challenge is that we're nowhere near there because even now, companies using the outputs of Hercules are having a tough time because, as I said, the system isn't set up to fairly appraise treatments for rare disease and pediatric diseases, more importantly for childhood diseases. So we still have a huge long way to go. And so Hercules is now moving into phase 2, where we're looking at a lot of different areas. We're looking at the impact of loss of function on your upper body, which is profound, I would say. I would say losing the use of your arms is even more devastating than losing the ability to walk, because when you lose the ability to walk, you have a wheelchair. Now, that's a whole other area of devastation and unmet need, because the wheelchairs that are given to patients on the NHS are frankly terrible and they are not fit for purpose. That's an area we're looking at. But when you lose the use of your arms, there is nothing there. Again, another area we are looking at, and we are hoping to launch a technical device next year that will address that. Currently filing for patents, so I can't really talk about it, but it's a very exciting area for us. But for patients, losing the use of your upper body is devastating. Yet in HTA minds and in regulatory minds, the major milestone is loss of ambulation. That's not, on the trajectory of the disease, most patients would tell you that's almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
Now, would I like my son to walk 3 years longer to stop him getting scoliosis so that he can walk, preserve heart function, cardiac function, pulmonary function? Of course. I would fight tooth and nail for a drug that would enable him to walk for 4 or 5 years longer. But what we need is a system that acknowledges that's not the only milestone and that there are others. So for Hercules, we're looking at that. And the other piece that we're looking at, which is hugely underlooked at, is the burden on caregivers.
Yeah.
And going back to where we started, Caitlin,
Yeah.
we cannot underestimate that.
Yeah.
And we had a situation last summer with NICE where they asked for an extra call for evidence. They gave us 6 weeks to provide further evidence in a rare disease, which is incredibly difficult to generate evidence in anyway.
Yeah.
But we did that, and we commissioned a piece of work with the University of Sheffield to look at patient caregiver burden. And it was devastating to listen to. And we are now currently thinking about, we submitted all the evidence to NICE, and we're now thinking about how we can disseminate that to a wider audience, because it needs to be front and center of any regulatory decision. The impact on caregivers, which is monumentally profound and devastating, and we must never forget that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Emily. I think that's all so inspiring, and it's just monumental work, and I can just imagine the number of lives impacted, and yeah, the value that it brings. One thing that did occur to me when you were giving the example of flow, And it brought me back to the question about how patient advocacy can help overcome challenges and just the value of patient advocates in general, which is that not only do we bring our lived experience and our passion, but we bring unique professional skills. So you're a rare disease mom who is a journalist, and I'm a science communication professional and a rare disease patient, and Flo was a health economist, is a health economist, and that intersection is something that you don't get in other spheres of professionalism, really, where you get that intersection. So it's really powerful, I think, that what that can achieve. And I mean, especially in an arena like rare diseases, the value of that intersection of skills and experience coming together is so critical.
Emily, that sounds fantastic. And I do think, actually following my U-Party training, I did actually get a little bit involved in a nice appraisal in the sense that they'd actually asked for patients to respond to a negative appraisal for a drug that I'd been on. And it was, I felt that kind of anger that you had. I think when I read it, because they said, oh, there's this quality of life metric specifically created for CF, but that's not the one we use here. So they just sort of ignored it. And there was nothing in there about the caregiver experience at all. And obviously that's not something from my perspective, but I found that a lot of the kind of reasoning that was used within that didn't consider the wider picture, didn't consider that, they said there was no long-term evidence. And it's like, well, how could there be long-term evidence when the drug's only been on the market for 2 years? Or that children haven't had it? You don't know what that's going to impact. And it just hadn't captured any of those human elements and the elements, as you mentioned, from a caregiver perspective. I mean, that has an impact on the healthcare system because of someone else's illness. So
Yeah.
if that isn't captured, then how can you possibly sort of model the cost effectiveness of something on a system if you're not considering all the different parts, if you're not considering how many sick days I would have taken off of work,
Yeah,
if you're not considering how many days that my dad had to take out of work to come take me to the hospital.
exactly.
There's so many elements that I felt were missing from that. And sure, it's not a model, but I think there was such a heavy response from the Cystic Fibrosis Trust mostly, but they also called for patients to write their own sort of personal point on that. And I think, while maybe the hard evidence wasn't there, the anecdotal and qualitative feedback that people gave overall at such a sort of, even from a rare disease perspective, on mass kind of thing, sort of shown how actually your models might never say what you want them to say, but your models aren't right for this disease. And I think that's similar to kind of the fight that you had as well. It's like, okay, this is the perspective you don't have, so how can we generate that evidence in the way that works for our disease area?
I totally hear you, and I think it is it's a sort of Kafkaesque disconnect between your lived experience, you know what you're talking about, and these sort of artificial parameters that are put in place. And I just want to mention an incredible patient advocate in the UK. His name is John Hasty, and he's living with Duchenne, and he was the patient expert at the most recent NICE appraisal. And there was a bizarre interaction where one of the economists was talking about data from the US, which couldn't really be used here because it was US data, not UK data. And John said to him, well, with all due respect, I think American patients who want to use non-invasive ventilation to breathe better want to do that because they have Duchenne, not because they're American. I still want to breathe better. It's the same disease whether you live in the US or whether you live in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And to not accept that evidence just feels,
yeah,
bizarre. So I agree. And this is going back to my point, there are so many challenges and the system needs to flex, not just say these are the challenges, flex to make them not challenges.
So, moving on, Emily, I think that this has been a really, really special conversation. It's been full of heart, and yeah, it's been a really it's been an honor to have you here for Rare Disease Day and hear your story, and really inspiring to hear about all the work that you've been doing. So, thank you for your time and for sharing all of that with us. We'll just wrap up with some quick fire questions, maybe. What would you say is your long-term dream for rare disease care?
My long-term dream is multi-layered, I think. On the first layer, when transformative treatments are proved as safe and effective, patients can get access straight away. And then we worry about how to pay for them. My second ambition is that in Duchenne, for instance, many treatments are off-label, they're off-patent, they're relatively inexpensive drugs. Let's roll them out to every patient living everywhere in the world. Let's make sure that every child diagnosed with a rare disease is given access as soon as possible to transformative treatments that will change their lives.
I think that's absolutely a dream that we can all get behind, Emily. So thank you for that. So for patient advocacy groups or people working in patient advocacy groups in the rare disease space, if you had one piece of advice for them, what would that be?
I'm feeling quite emotional as we record this. Rare Disease Day is a powerful way of bringing a community together. And, there are thousands of parents out there fighting for their children, fighting for their disease. And I know how hard it is and how lonely it is and how much resilience you need to get out of bed each day and fight the good fight. And I'm always reminded of this poem by the American poet Mary Oliver. And the last two lines are, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And I suppose in your darkest moments, just remember that we all only have one wild and precious life. And what do we do with it? We want to leave this world in a slightly better place than where we found it. And if all of us do our part, we will make a difference. And no matter how hard and difficult the journey is, it matters and it counts. And we are, one incredible community fighting against the odds to try and make a difference. So my advice would be take one day at a time. You don't have to solve everything all at once. And surround yourself with resilient people. Find the people who are climbing the mountains and climb together.
I love that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, really beautiful. Thank you. That's really lovely. What advice would you have for other stakeholders looking to engage with rare disease focused patient advocacy groups?
My one piece of advice would be, or my one plea actually, would be to stop calling it the patient perspective, right? Because we're the only ones who have that preface, patient perspective. But if you give us the perspective, it implies that everyone else is speaking the one truth. Everything is a perspective in drug development. If you look at what we did with Hercules in redefining the natural history model, we redefined that model because we listened to patients. So there's the clinical perspective, which is really valid and important. There's the patient perspective. There's no one big truth. So either call me patient perspective and call everyone else clinician perspective, pharma perspective, regulatory perspective, or don't call me patient perspective. I'm an expert. I will talk about Duchenne. I'm an expert in many areas of drug development, not so much in others. But treat us with the respect that you treat everyone else. And I promise you, you will get better treatments, you will get better outcomes, you will get better run clinical trials, you will be able to recruit more quickly for those trials. It will benefit everybody.
Reach to that, Emily. I think that's fantastic, and it actually ties in really nicely with the theme that we've been hearing coming up to 2026 is just being collaboration and making sure that the quote unquote patient is a stakeholder in the room of equal weight to every other stakeholder. And it's not that the patient is the most important by well, they are in the sense of that's what we're aiming to do, but in that room of trying to develop medicines or evolve care, everyone should have sort of relevance and importance, and that includes the patient as well. And that collaboration is something that's really important and needs to happen a lot more.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you once again, Emily. That was just beautiful, and it's been more than a pleasure having you here. And we'll hold this in a special place in our hearts and on our podcast channel.
Well, it was a real honour to chat to you both and hear both of your incredible stories. And it's a real testament to you that you're turning your experiences into, a podcast that can help influence people and help them to change the world. So thank you so much for having me.